Welcome to It Pays to Fear God. I am Ewaenruwa Nomaren, and I want to discuss the topic, the dumbest things Christians do. As the world gradually becomes more secular and political, the kinds of things Christians do from day to day can be considered pretty dumb in the biblical view. They may be seen as very normal in mainstream society and spirituality, but when we actually go into the Bible and come and have an understanding of what it means to be a Christian, a child of God, etc., those things seem pretty foolish. Before I get into the subject, though, I just want to throw a question at you that might spark some thought and interest in the comments section below. And that question is, do you think it's okay for Christians to dabble into politics, or do you feel that they should stay completely clear of political leaders and what they talk about on the news? But of course, for now, let's just get into some of those dumb things that Christians do. One of them is monetizing Christianity. To monetize Christianity is to make Christianity all about money. It doesn't necessarily have to do with make money out of Christianity, but it is to corner Christianity, its purpose, why it's there, etc., to money-related subjects. If you look at what the Pharisees were doing in Judea, you can clearly see that money was becoming a bigger part of it than it was supposed to. For example, there were money changers and sellers that the Pharisees were, number one, aware of, and number two, a part of, associated with them, etc. In that Matthew chapter 21 and verses 12 and 13. And they would excuse people from various biblical laws if they gave gifts, money, etc. If you read Mark chapter 7 from verses 11 to 13. And if you look at Micah chapter 3 verse 11, Micah the prophet had described the various prophets, priests, etc. in his time as ones who divined for money and other stuff like that. The heads thereof judge for reward, and the priests thereof teach for hire, and the prophets thereof divine for money. Yet will they lean upon the Lord and say, Is not the Lord among us? None evil can come upon us. If you look at Micah chapter 3 verse 11. They are companions of thieves. They are rebellious. They try to milk for as much wealth for themselves as possible. If we read Isaiah chapter 1 verse 23. And obviously, it's not necessarily just pastors that are seeking after money in this world. Christians themselves, they make Christianity just about money. Everything that they pray for is about money. God's blessings can only be about money. Remember, God isn't necessarily a money person. He's not, somebody who just invests in money, gives his children money. His blessings vary. His blessings can be peace. His blessing can be wisdom. James chapter 1 verse 5, Matthew chapter 11 from verses 28 to 30, John chapter 14 verse 27, those kinds of rewards and blessings, the Bible talks about them, but Christians don't focus on them because they see all the kinds of things that money can buy. Bugattis, mansions, a fantastic mortgage, a very luxurious and lavish life. They see other people, their neighbors, friends, etc., living those great, in quote, lives, but they are not content with God's blessings anymore because of all that stuff that they're seeing in the world. However, we should not monetize Christianity for a couple of reasons. Number one, money is not an invention created by God. It is the mammon of unrighteousness, and it came from what we call another man. If we read Luke chapter 16 verse 12, and that man is Satan the devil. He is the owner of the economy and everything like that, because God did not set up the world to have an economy, to have politics and all the other stuff that Satan created in this world. Therefore, when we want to bring Christianity down to just money, we're making Christianity just about what Satan has provided in this world. And if you look at places like 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 10, it tells us that money is indeed the root of all evil. For the love of money is the root of all evil. which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. And if you look at Ecclesiastes chapter 5 verse 10, King Solomon warned us that money is not something that satisfies souls. He that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver, nor he that loveth abundance with increase. This is also vanity. Now, am I telling you to be poor? Am I telling you to forsake everything that you've got? No, but rather, instead of making Christianity all about money, we should use our money to build a better relationship with God. Make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when ye fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitations. Who are those friends we're supposed to make with the mammon of unrighteousness or money? It is God and Jesus Christ. We can use our money to support the people that they have in this world. If we read Matthew chapter 10 verse 42, we can invest in trying to understand God and His purpose. There are a lot of facts we do not know about Him. If we read Job chapter 36 verse 26, but when we invest money, time, etc. into trying to learn more about those things, God will reveal a lot about Himself to us. We can use our money to do that, or as most Christians do, we can also use money to corner Christianity to just in this world, as in they make Christianity all about the mammon of unrighteousness and how to attain or obtain as much of it as possible. Then another dumb, foolish thing that Christians do is to bring God into their worldly lust. It's kind of similar to the last one, but really it has to do with you as a Christian not wanting God to guide you, what you're interested in, etc. No, you want to drag God along what you like to do. It seems like something Christians wouldn't do, but unfortunately it is indeed very common. And to understand this concept more, we could look at the kinds of things that children in this world do. The Bible had prophesied that children will become oppressors, ruling over adults, etc. And obviously this is very evident. If we read Isaiah chapter 3 and verses 4, 5, and 12, and 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12. Before, when kids used to take guidance from their parents, they would listen to their parents and let their parents decide what they should be interested in, what their destiny should be, what their future should be. But now, children want to dictate to their parents what that future should look like. It's a complete flip over of what we call the hierarchy of obedience if we read 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 3. And of course, in Isaiah chapter 24 from verses 1 to 7, it prophesied about how everything will be turned over on its head. Children should be obeying their parents if we read Ephesians chapter 6 from verses 1 to 3, taking guidance from them, honoring them if we read Exodus chapter 20 verse 12. And the children of God, Christians in this world, have to do that same thing to God and Jesus Christ. Instead of trying to drag God along the worldly lusts that we see in this world, the pride of life, the lust of the eyes, etc. If we read 1 John chapter 2 verse 16, we should trust God that He knows what we will need to live a very fruitful life. If we read Proverbs chapter 3 from verses 5, 6, and 7. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct thy paths. Be not wise in thine own eyes, fear the Lord, and depart from evil, as that Proverbs chapter 3 from verses 5 to 7 reads. We should trust that God can supply all our needs according to His riches and glory in Christ Jesus. If we read Philippians chapter 4 verse 19. Abraham was somebody who demonstrated this concept. He wasn't trying to dictate to God where he should be traveling. Oh, let me travel back to the Chaldeans. Oh, let me travel to Gaza, where it was located. No, he just let God guide him to the promised land. That was why the relationship God had with Abraham was not only so smooth, but God sustained his patience and love for the Israelites. If we read Deuteronomy chapter 7 from verses 7 to 9, till they went into the land of Canaan. And even when they would mess up, he still remembered them because of the faith of their father, Abraham. Another dumb thing Christians do is what we see in Hosea chapter 6 verse 6, which reads, "For I desired mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings." Physically, in Israelite time, as the verse explains, the Israelites would offer burnt offerings, etc. And of course, burnt offerings were just physical animals, and if that was all what being an Israelite was about, that wouldn't have not only been very easy, but it would have been pointless because God already had animals. He had them in abundance. If we read Isaiah chapter 1 verse 11, and David himself admitted this in Psalm chapter 51. Worshipping God is more than just offerings and sacrifices. It was about love, mercy, judgments, etc. If we read Matthew chapter 23 verse 23. God is a spirit. If we read John chapter 4 verse 24, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And in the Christian world today, people think that all you need to do to worship God and Jesus Christ is to just go to church, sing, listen to a pastor, and go home. Because they look at Acts chapter 16 verse 25 and 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 from verses 16 to 18, where it was talking about rejoicing and celebrating and singing, etc. However, the Bible has made us to understand the facts that worshiping God requires our heart. And in 1 Timothy chapter 4 verse 8, St. Paul told us that the physical things don't really mean all that much, but the spiritual things are what really count. For bodily exercise profiteth little, but godliness is profitable unto all things, having promise of the life that now is, and of that which is to come. Another thing that Christians do is mixing church and state. The church represents spirituality generally, while the state is politics. We're not supposed to be trusting in political leaders. Put not your trust in princes, nor in the Son of Man, in whom there is no help. His breath goeth forth, he returneth to his earth, and that very day his thoughts perish. Psalm chapter 146 in verses 3 and 4. However, in this world we're seeing that Christians are running after political leaders. They believe in them. They actually hope and have faith in them instead of God. And if you look at what happened in the Bible, you can see that kind of unison, that belief that prophets, spiritual leaders generally had in their political leaders. And obviously, that arrangement wasn't exactly correct. For example, in 1 Kings chapter 22, King Ahab was an evil political leader because he didn't do what God wanted him to do when putting him in office, but he had 400 yes men, essentially, but they would call themselves prophets who would prophesy in Ahab's favor all the time. If you wanted to battle in Ramoth Gilead, God is with you. If you wanted to conquer Gaza, God is with you. And of course, that kind of unison is not what you're supposed to have. Spiritual leaders are supposed to be advisors of the political leaders to guide them in the way God wants them to rule citizens and the land. If you look at how the Pharisees and the chief priests and the Jews generally made a relationship with the Romans, you can see that same kind of bad unison that political leaders had with spiritual leaders. King Herod was friends with Pilate. If we read Luke chapter 23 verse 12 and in John chapter 19 verse 15, the chief priests were happy to announce and tell Jesus Christ that we are subjects of Caesar, not of you. Jesus Christ was their opportunity to return back to God and what he wanted from them, but they were proud to say we are citizens and subjects of Caesar and he is our king. All of this can be contrasted with Nathan and David. Nathan was not afraid to go to David and tell him that he sinned in 1 Samuel chapter 12. Most prophets would be shaky. What if I prophesy against him and he's going to kill me? What if I tell him that he sinned and he's going to throw me in prison, like what happened to Micaiah in 1 Kings chapter 22? No, Nathan didn't care. He was somebody spiritual, and he went straight to David when he committed adultery and said, you have sinned and God is angry with you. And of course, David repented because he was a righteous man, and the psalm in Psalm chapter 51 expressed his feelings in detail. And in our time, the last days, the Bible has prophesied, and we can see that the political system is growing. If you read Matthew chapter 24 in verses 15 and 16, the abomination of desolation, the political system that's ruling this world and other stuff like that is taking over the world because God intended that to remove the spirituality that was in unison with political leaders. If you read Revelation chapter 17 and verses 16 and 17. But Christians are not supposed to be running after that. They're not supposed to be believing in those leaders. Oh, yes, right on, brother, or whatever they want to say. No, it's rather we should understand the fact that this is only happening for two reasons. One, like I just said, to take away that fake spirituality that didn't represent what God wanted. And number two, to refine us. Though that thing is kind of like a temptation. The strength and power that political leaders have, independent of spiritual forces and authority, is like a temptation that we are not supposed to run after. And when we do not run after it, we are refined. If you read Zechariah chapter 13 and verses 8 and 9, and James chapter 1 from verses 2 to 4, but specifically verses 2 and 3. Christians are supposed to generally obey their governments, pay taxes, etc. If we read Romans chapter 13 verse 1, 1 Peter chapter 2 and verses 13 and 14, etc. But their hearts are supposed to go to God. As Jesus Christ said, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things which are God's. In Matthew chapter 22 verse 21. The last thing that I want to talk about that Christians do that is considered dumb in the Bible is having unhealthy relationships. A common thing that Christians do in this world, be it if you're a woman or a man, is to just have sex with whoever they want to, and then after they do everything that a married couple is supposed to do, they then decide, should I get married? Marriage isn't for me. I don't want to deal with this person. I just wanted to collect all the goodies and leave the problems that come with marriage, and that is what they do. However, the Bible has told us that obviously fornication isn't good. If we read Galatians chapter 5 verse 19 and Hebrews chapter 13 verse 4 and other places, but it's not just because fornication isn't good. It's also because that's just not what God intended. God intended that a man and a woman get married, the sex seals the marriage together, and they remain in that condition. If you read Genesis chapter 2 and verses 23 and 24, and later repeated by Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 19, from verses 1 to 16 or so, but in particular, verse 8. Christians are not supposed to be doing things backwards. First of all, enjoying everything that you get from marriage, and then deciding whether they want to actually step into the institution. You do things properly by entering into it first, and then doing all those other things that married couples do. But obviously, mistakes happen, and if you look at Shechem in Genesis chapter 34 from verses 1 to 12, that was the kind of thing that happened. He had sex, or he slept with Dinah, one of Leah's daughters, and of course, once he realized that, this has happened, he just decided to go marry Dinah. There was no, do you think I should marry her? Whatever, let me just not. No, he immediately said, okay, I'm sorry I offended you guys, let me just marry this girl so that everything can just go fine. Christians are supposed to be in that condition. I think it's pretty clear now what kind of things Christians do and why the Bible isn't in support of them. One thing you might have been able to identify or realize with all these things that Christians do is that they're caused by one misunderstanding. The misunderstanding of a Christian. The identity of a Christian. Most Christians, in quote, don't really know who they really are supposed to be. However, Christians have to take the time to study what it really means to be a Christian. For example, we have to be after God's heart, like David, if we read Acts chapter 13, verse 22, and for Samuel chapter 13, verse 14. We're not just supposed to go to church, sing, but then live completely different lives. We're not to be conformed to this world, loving this world, etc. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may know what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. There is no better example of what a Christian should do than Jesus Christ himself. If we read 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 21 and 23. He was a good example because what God wanted was what he wanted. There was a perfect relationship between him and God. He loved righteousness just like God did. If we read Psalms chapter 45, verse 7. And he boasted about it in many places. I can of my own self do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not mine own will, but the will of the Father which hath sent me. John chapter 5, verse 30. For I came down from heaven, not to do mine own will, but the will of him that sent me. John chapter 6, verse 38. See also John chapter 4, verse 34, chapter 12 and verses 49 and 50, and even chapter 14, verse 28, where he specifically said, For my Father is greater than I. That is the kind of example we are supposed to follow. He was not linked with political leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. He didn't create a bond with them. He distanced himself from them because he knew they were not, right? He wasn't trying to make wealth for himself like Christians try to do in this world. And he didn't bring God into whatever he wanted. No, he would always say, it's God's will that I want to fulfill, especially in Matthew chapter 26 and verses 39 and 42. If we want to be a Christian, that is how we do so. And I don't think I need to talk anymore on the subject, the dumbest things Christians do. That is a lot of information, but let's just cool down with the tune that some of us might enjoy. I know this subject might be a little hard to take in, but if we want to be smart Christians, all we need to do is to pray to God for wisdom, and he'll be happy to lend us what we need. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. Have a good day, and remember to be a smart Christian.